My dear brothers and sisters, today's edition of A Taste of Sri Aurobindo is titled Specialization and Synthesis, and it's based on the first few lines of Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga. But before I go further, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. How would you normally expect a book on yoga to start? Maybe with the definition of yoga or the antiquity of yoga. Since when has yoga been known? What are the first evidences of the practice of yoga, particularly in India? But Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga doesn't start in any of these ways. Like all the works of Sri Aurobindo, the beginning is simply majestic. And before I say anything more, let me read it out. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity, whether they belong to our ordinary fields of movement or seek those exceptional spheres and fulfillments which appear to us high and divine. Every such form tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality, which again breaks apart into various channels of special effort and tendency, only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. Let me go over it slowly. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity. Now, these two necessities will become clear by the time we reach the end of this passage. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity. What are the greater forms of human activity? Sri Aurobindo talks about in the next few words the two broad categories of those greater forms of human activity, whether they belong to our ordinary fields of movement, that is, which are more concrete, uh, familiar to us, uh, part of our sensory experience. Within that, also, we have some great forms of human activity, for example, literature, art, music, scientific research, and so on and so forth. So, this is one category of the greater forms of human activity. And what is the other form? Those exceptional spheres and fulfillments which appear to us high and divine, those which are somewhat otherworldly in nature, which deal with the divine, and that is the category to which yoga belongs, as we all know. So, both these greater forms of human activity, be they uh, a part of our ordinary fields of movement, or be they a part of those activities which we consider high and divine, both these greater forms of human activity are characterized by two necessities. Now, what are those two necessities? Every such form tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality, which again breaks apart into various channels of special effort and tendency, only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. So there's a cyclic pattern which characterizes these greater forms of human activity. They start with a harmonized complexity and totality. That is a broad idea which is grand and harmonized, and it is total, uh, it is comprehensive in nature. But then this is followed by its breaking apart into various channels of special effort, which we may call specialization. So we start with a grand idea, and then the period of or era of specialization intervenes, and then only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. And then there is once again a synthesis which is more puissant, that is, more powerful, more effective than the grand totality with which we started. Now, let's see this in relation to these two forms of human activity, the ordinary fields of movement or those types of greater forms of human activity which are considered high and divine. Now, amongst the ordinary fields of movement, let's look at medicine. It started with the grand idea of preventing and treating disease, and this was done by a person who knew quite a bit about how to take care of all these aspects. A family generally had one doctor who took care of everybody in the family from womb to tomb. But then came the era of specialization, and we had a specialist for each part of the body, and it went to such ridiculous heights that it was jokingly said that soon we'll have specialization to such an extent that we'll have a different doctor for the right eye and the left eye. Two types of ophthalmologists, the right eye specialist and the left eye specialist. But before that ridiculous type of an extreme was reached, there was an urge for synthesis. And the synthesis has been expressed through, the various types of new specialities that came up, like family medicine, holistic medicine, mind-body medicine, community medicine. Now, all these specialities reflect an urge for synthesis because it was felt that the specialization had gone a little too far. While it is serving a purpose, there is also need to maintain certain disciplines within medicine which are more broad-based, which look at the person as a whole rather than look at one part of the body. Now, this new synthesis that we have in all these disciplines like family medicine, community medicine, and mind-body medicine, and so on, this new synthesis is more powerful and more effective than the grand idea with which we started when the same doctor took care of a person from womb to tomb. And why is that so? Because this new synthesis can now benefit from the era of specialization. All the advances that took place during the era of specialization, this grand synthesis can now make use of, and therefore this new synthesis is more powerful than the science of medicine that we had before the era of specialization. And why was the era of specialization also necessary? That was necessary because without concentrated effort on one part of the body, that specialization could not have developed to the extent that it did. So we would have never known as much about eye diseases as we do if some people at least had concentrated on the health and disease so far as the eyes went. And in the same way, some people looked at lungs, and the advances that we made in pulmonology could not have been made without that concentrated attention on that limited sphere. And all these benefits have not been thrown away. They have been utilized and incorporated into the new syntheses that we have in the form of holistic medicine and mind-body medicine and community medicine and so on. So these new forms of synthesis are more powerful and effective than the grand idea with which we started. So not only this is a cyclic pattern which seemed to characterize all the greater forms of human activity, it also is a necessity. And therefore, right in the beginning, Aurobindo says in the very first sentence, there are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity. These two necessities seem to intervene, which means that they are inevitable, as if through some unstoppable force, they just occur. So it's not that if we do not like the era of specialization, it will not happen, or if we do not want a resynthesis, a fresh synthesis, that will not happen. It characterizes these forms of human activity because it is just inevitable, as if some unstoppable force is intervening to make sure that this cyclic pattern would continue. Now let's look at the same thing in relation to yoga, which belongs to the type of human activities which are considered high and divine. We started with a grand idea of a methodized effort towards self-perfection, that is using some sort of a method for moving towards self-perfection. The various steps in self-perfection can be called self-improvement So, perpetual self improvement taking us to self perfection, which characterizes all parts of the being, the body and the mind having its two aspects, feeling and thinking. So, so a movement of the body, the emotional part of the being, and the intellect towards perfection through methodized effort. That is, through personal effort, which has a certain method about it. It is not haphazard effort. Methodized effort is always more effective than haphazard effort. For example, steam is very powerful, but then if we just let it escape uh, in the kitchen from an open utensil, it doesn't serve much purpose. But if we uh, adopt a method, we trap it in a pressure cooker, then the same steam becomes very powerful and effective and reduces the time required for cooking. So, a methodized effort is more powerful and more effective than any haphazard effort. So, yoga is a methodized effort which is designed to improve all parts of the being, the body, and the mind. And the ultimate aim is self perfection because uh, incremental improvement will take us towards a point where there will be no defect left. And that is what self perfection is. And since, by very definition, only God is perfect, man is imperfect. So, this stage of self perfection is considered union with the divine. All this comes in the same chapter a little later, but we can see that this is the broad, grand idea with which yoga started. Then came the era of specialization. Now, self improvement affects all parts of the being. Some people concentrated on perfection of the body, and some on perfection of the mind. Concentration or perfection of the body gave us hatha yoga, and concentration on perfection of the mind gave us Patanjali's yoga, which is also called Ashtanga yoga or Raja yoga, and that gave us the foundation of the techniques of meditation. So while hatha yoga gave us the physical practices like asanas and pranayamas, uh, Patanjali's yoga gave us the foundation for a very comprehensive uh, technique for meditation. Now, this was the era of specialization. But then the specialization went to such an extent that the outer form started overshadowing the underlying spirit. Now, that is one of the costs that we have to pay for this degree of specialization because form takes over the spirit. Form starts dominating the spirit. In fact, to some extent, converting any idea into a form involves some degree of dilution of the idea, the spirit behind the idea. That gets diluted once it acquires a form, but yet to be able to practice that idea, to be able to practice that grand concept, we have to give it a form. For example, we may have grand ideas about education, but then we have to give it a form in terms of a curriculum and classrooms and so on and so forth. So every grand idea to be implemented needs a form, but then giving it a form involves an inevitable dilution of the spirit. And the greater the specialization, more is the dilution of the spirit. And that is why, once again, there is an urge felt for synthesis. And that happened also in yoga, and that is what Sri Aurobindo felt when he was writing this book. In fact, he wrote it as a series of articles in the Arya, but then it eventually has become this book that we call the Synthesis of Yoga. Sri Aurobindo felt that the era of specialization in the field of yoga had gone to an extent that the external forms of the practice had come to overshadow the underlying spirit of yoga. And we can easily relate to it because, to some extent, that continues even today. We tend to identify yoga with the techniques like asanas, pranayamas, and meditation, and quite often divorce it completely from the underlying spirit of yoga. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo felt that to be able to revive and once again bring in this idea, a synthesis of different types of specialization of yoga was needed, and that's why he wrote this, and that is exactly what he has done in this book, The Synthesis of Yoga. So now let's go over the passage again. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity. So what are these two necessities? starting with a grand idea, breaking it up into various degrees of various types of specialized effort. So, a synthesized, or you can say a totality, then specialization, which focuses on different aspects of this totality, and then once again a synthesis. So, totality, breaking it down into specialities, and once again a synthesis. So, these two necessities, that is, breaking it into specialities and then a resynthesis, these are the two necessities. So, specialization is a necessity, and a fresh synthesis, a resynthesis, is also a necessity. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity, whether these activities belong, whether they belong to our ordinary fields of movement, like medicine, or seek those exceptional spheres and fulfillments which appear to us high and divine, like yoga. Every such form tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality. That is, every such form means every greater form of human activity. That's what every such form refers to. Every such form, that is, every greater form of human activity, tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality. So that is the beginning. Harmonized complexity and totality. That is a comprehensive, holistic view of the uh, activity, which again breaks apart into various channels of special effort and tendency. So then there is a tendency to uh, break apart into various channels of special effort, that is concentrated effort on a narrow area of that subject. And then what happens? Only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. So once again, there is a fresh synthesis, and this synthesis is far more powerful than the complexity and totality, harmonized complexity and totality with which we started, because now this fresh synthesis can benefit from the era of specialization. This passage is such a grand and majestic opening that I feel like reading it once more without uh, giving into the temptation of trying to explain it. And I hope you'll enjoy listening to it as much as I would enjoy reading it. There are two necessities of nature's workings which seem always to intervene in the greater forms of human activity, whether they belong to our ordinary fields of movement or seek those exceptional spheres and fulfillments which appear to us high and divine. Every such form tends towards a harmonized complexity and totality, which again breaks apart into various channels of special effort and tendency, only to unite once more in a larger and more puissant synthesis. Thank you.